morning. Good morning. I hope everybody's having a grand day. I'm just getting a little bit started. I've actually been up for a while, but I'm trying to get things all together. Perfect. I wanted to go ahead and touch on a few things today with Neledi. But first, everybody coming in, anybody who is new to this space, I want to remind everybody that this is a safe space. I do not deal with racism or phobias against gender or desire very well. And race has been debunked. It doesn't exist. Racism still exists, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that it stops existing, othering as a whole. And I appreciate it if you leave religion out of my chat, because this is not a space for religion. Other than that, it's really a space of learning. I do this because I believe that education is gate kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls, and because it's gate kept by extremely verbose, which is also verbose, big words. Like it's gate kept behind stuff that it's hard for anybody to understand, even if you are somebody with a lot of degrees. I find things hard to understand when I'm reading them, even having a few degrees and having degrees in both, science and medicine. It's extremely hard sometimes. And so I come on here just to try and give people an opportunity and a chance to really understand some of the things. Of course, some of the understanding is my perspective, and to really kind of move forward with a new understanding of who we are as we have this new understanding of our evolution and who we are as a species. So in this space, again, it's an educational platform. We try and make sure that everything stays as positive as possible. I do have moderators in here. If it gets bad, when it gets up to a few hundred people in here, it can get really bad, and I'll turn off the comments for a while. But hopefully we won't have to do that, because a lot of times you can really get some beautiful education out of the fellow commenters. So I'm going to hopefully be able to leave them on. I want to talk about Neledi today. I've been really fascinated since good morning, Christy. I've been really fascinated since we started coming across the newer things within Neledi in the last couple of years. And as I've watched, it's often been like with this bubbly, joyous glee. You should have seen me watching with my granddaughter this last week. It was very much because she's very anthropologically inclined. And so she, as we were talking, and I'm like, oh, look at that, oh, look at that, and just giddy and joyous. And I don't know if you watched the documentary, but some of it is stuff that Lee Berger released last year in his lecture, and some of it is entirely new, because he had talked about in his lecture that there were things that he would be releasing over the next 18 months, about 3 or 4 more things that were very, mind-blowing in the shift of the understanding that is happening within paleoanthropology and the theory of evolution and thought process, and within genetics and within science right now. And so I'm really, really, into this, right? Right now, we don't know Neledi's origins other than where they are, where we are finding them. And the finding of them is in the Rising Star Caves, I think it's right outside of Johannesburg, to my memory on a map, but I'm globally disinclined or geographically disinclined, so my memory could be slightly off. They are a really cool, small-bodied species that is built just as much for climbing as it is for moving across distance. And that in itself, to me, is an extremely fascinating thought process, to see a species that is the same time frame as we're coming into being. We believe that the very start of our species, the earliest we have found of our species, is 300,000 years old right now in Morocco. We believe that the start of our species is a convergent of many different species. We don't believe that Neledi is one of the species so far And this is what I'm seeing coming across in the articles and journals, the anthropologists talking about this. We don't believe that Neledi contributes to our genetics, but as we're coming on to play, Neledi is there. And Neledi is there as the only species that is doing so many different things. Um, and because Neledi is there as a species that's doing so many different things, that understanding and that movement forward that Neledi has that we don't have and none of the other species around us have for another couple 100,000 years is so impactful to our understanding of how is it that we get where we're at? How is it that we went from just another large brain hominin who we don't believe had the, uh, we don't have evidence, had the synapses firing, we think it is, that we do now, which is, I personally think, having to do with the malleability of the brain. This is actually what we're teaching in paleoanthropology, or were a couple of years ago. Malleability of the brain, which has to do with the amount of life stages that we have. And within all of that, we know we don't start burying our dead until roughly 100,000 years ago. We don't know how we processed our dead so much before then. The bones that we have found, for the most part, are bones that we have found, we believe, in cave collapses of pretty much any other species pre 100,000 years ago. So when we're looking at Neledi and seeing a species that is coming in, um, 35,000 years before we know that we're on the scene, and that's the range that we found Neledi in currently. It's only 100,000 years and it's only in this specific space. So we don't know whether they're branching out. There might be Neledi in spaces that we haven't found them before. You're right that that's what they teach us, but that's doesn't mean that they're right. Or, and that's why you should always look at the 2 or 3 different opposing views that are coming out. And you should always make your own judgment based on those opposing views. There are certain things that we currently believe as fact. Fact changes, theory changes. Theory is a tested, belief, or a tested thought process, hypothesis. Um, Yet these things are always changing. And it is that changing and understanding that we should actually cherish and love. This is something that is very innate to our species. This need to know is seen in us more than any other species. And when you block that need to know, when you decide that that need to know is somehow a bad or an evil or a sin, that's problematic because that's toxic to our species as a whole. Species don't do toxic things as a species whole. They're not innate in a species. Because to do things that are toxic to your species growth and development ends your species. And we're supposed to be working on growing species, right? Like everybody I've ever talked to believes that the purpose that we have is to procreate as a base. Like maybe they have other beliefs in that, but vast majority of people are like, we're here to make the species bigger. I wish we weren't thinking that, because I would disagree. Yet to keep species healthy and whole, one needs to have curiosity and knowledge. I don't know, Giovanni. I would state that, okay, so the question is, I'm so curious to know how you get an isolate language in civilization like the Quirpaca, and I may not be pronouncing that right, in Mexico. So, Giovanni, I'm not sure. That's not something I study. I would state that it's probably a group that has been semi-isolated for a while, a community that has been semi-isolated for a while, and that there were several waves of migration to Turtle Island and Abya Yala, Turtle Island being North America and Abya Yala being South America. And in those waves of migration, well, I don't think that, it's distinguishable to a point that they're not ever coming into contact with each other over the last 33 to 52,000 years, which is our current understanding of how things are starting to come across to Turtle Island and Abiyala. But I would say, I hate that, sorry, and it's just one of those things that slips in. I would say that uh, it is probably a group that has been isolated for a semi period of time, like the Basque in Spain. Um, and in that isolation, they have developed a language that um, its root goes further back than our understanding. And as a scientific community, or our understanding as academics, or our understanding as just regular Joe people, right? And so that's how you get that, right? Okay, I'm going to focus on the Ledi. That's interesting. Um, so when we're looking at species before us, when we're looking at the anthropological, paleoanthropological thought processes of species before us, we see so far that we're not burying our dead until 100,000 years ago. And that starts, I've seen things that have Neanderthal starting earlier than sapien, and I've seen things that have sapien starting earlier. Because there's a range on dating, a lot of times you'll have people use the low end and other people use the high end. And so that can differentiate in certain people's groupings of when things are starting. So what we're looking at before then is absolutely smaller cave, or sorry, smaller groups in caves that have collapsed. And this is the majority of the bones that we find. Every once in a while, we'll find them for other reasons. There's a couple spaces I know that we found them that aren't necessarily caves. And maybe we found only singulars so far in that space. But I can't think off the top of my head exactly. But I do know that we believe that they have been exposed to the elements otherwise, because that is where they have fallen. And we did not have the cognitive thought process that the dead needed to be buried. Whether that's like an object permanence thing, whether that's a conscious thing, not sure. Conscious and object permanence, are they the same? When we're looking at that, that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't happening. And I think Neledi kind of shows that as well. What it means is that throughout our entire time, we've probably had different burial practices, at least when we start burying. We know even until today that there are burial practices across the globe that will expose the body to the elements, maybe to vultures, maybe to other carnivores, to give the body the chance to return to and replenish the biome that it comes from. Are those practices in use before? We don't know. And we very much always consider the fact that lack of evidence does not equate evidence. It also doesn't equate lack of evidence. Like, it just equates what we don't know. And so we have no evidence on these thought processes. And we have belief currently from the evidence that we do have that it is just kind of a drop in place. So this would be a burial 125 to 100 to 235,000 years ago. Maths is not my thing. When we're looking at that, this is 125 to 235,000 years before us. This, when we're looking at it, is this huge sense of understanding that we're not the first, and we are also relatively young in the idea of it, that it is seen before. People often think that the icons that we have made to our own self-importance exist in the archaeological record forever. And they think of that because of things like ancient Greece, Syria, Hammurabi. And they think of that because of the fact that we can find some megalithic structures that go back really far. Yet I want you to think and understand of the timeline of the oldest things that we have found so far as structures, and how long we ourselves have existed as a species, and how long other species of human being Homo, being the genus that we fall under, other species of human, and then other species of hominin have existed before us. Mammals go back to the time of dinosaurs and before, like the time of dinosaurs, the mammal was a little shrew-like creature, and during the time of dinosaurs, it grew and changed. There was a recent thing about one eating a lizard recently, coming across my newsfeed. There is so much time that just spans across that we don't seem to understand. We seem to think that everything in history, um, which is the last since written word, which can go back to about 5,000 years ago, I think, at its earliest, 6,000 years ago at its earliest. Though there is recent cave art and things like that that put it back 27,000 years ago and beyond. Um, we look at written history as the only period of history in which we've lived. So there are so many things that could have been built up that have just gone away. The bones are such a degradable substance that any exposed are going to degrade swiftly, faster than anything else, really, except for like our flesh. Like, bone is a degradable substance. It can fossilize, and would definitely degrade faster, and that's why we haven't found that. It can fossilize, and it can stay in certain environments a lot better than it can stay in other environments. It is still a degradable substance, right? It still returns to the earth, which is the purpose of all of this, is to return to the earth and create this biome, right? The Netflix documentary was released this year, and it actually was just released within the last month or so. There was a couple of lectures that Graham did, and actually, I do believe I still have one on my website that Graham did that went over the new things with Neledi. But he only touched on a couple of different subjects. I think that the reason that we found Neledi is because Neledi is so far back, and it's so deep, and it's so hard to get to, that it is, I realize that I'm using the word it, and I do not want to do that. They are so far back and so hard to get to that it is hard for us, and so we haven't gotten to them and explored them yet. And it is also hard for the elements, on some levels, because the earth itself is an elemental force that kind of, degrades a skeleton on its own. And being in a cave that's hot and moist, though probably cooler than most spaces around, is also going to degrade more. This documentary is showing not just burial. This documentary is showing the use of fire. This documentary is showing the traveling of fire. He is using, and he brought this up in the lecture, he is using the traces of smoke or soot on the ceilings in the passageways, that show the carrying of fire in some manner through those passageways so they can see where they're going. Lee Berger is the lead archaeologist on this, and Lee Berger has not been able to be in the actual burial cave this entire time. He actually, it's a very small entrance. It's like just tiny, tiny, tiny through some spaces. They actually reached out to all the paleoanthropologists that they knew, or all the people really that they knew on a lot of areas, to who were smaller in frame so that they could get through some of these initially. So Lee has taken a long time to get to the point that he can get into this space. And because Lee has taken a lot of time to get to the point where he can get into this space, and he never thought he was actually going to make it into this space, this documentary really going over that very well. You see that he discovers things that nobody else really had noticed as he's going through the passageways. And one of these things that he discovers that nobody else had really noticed, or that people just kind of attributed to nature, were hashtags, which is just funny as can be. But not just crosshatches, right? Um, but also some of these, as you look, and I really encourage, because I don't, some of these to me remind me of runic writing in the way that there are lines, which I'm not sure are Neledi carving the lines in themselves and then carving in between the lines, in crosshatches and lines in between the lines. I have not found actual images of this, or I would have brought them in and showed them. It is a powerful and impactful statement that Neledi was doing art, cave art, carving into walls 335,000 years ago. We hadn't even come on the scene. And when we came on the scene, we didn't have the understanding and the capacity to do that for another 100 and something thousand years, almost 200,000 years. So when we're looking at that, that itself is impactful. It is a shift in our understanding of, oh my God, we're the smartest and the best. Oh my God, we did everything first, right? That we seem to have. It tells us, hi, Wicked. It tells us that the movement forward, the creativity, the thought process, the thing that we think makes us human and makes us different from every other species on the planet doesn't make us different. Other species did this. I was in a live last night where they were talking about Mesoamerica pre-contact culture. And they've been reading from a book that was descriptions from European standpoints of people when they arrived, right? And then we were talking about, the knowledge that the people from Latin America and South America, so southern portion of Turtle Island and from Abiyala, talking about the accounts from them of who they are and stuff like that. And we were talking about the knowledge that there are these vast civilizations that are more advanced than the European civilizations when Europeans arrive. And these vast civilizations that are more advanced than the European civilizations when the European civilizations arrive are not accounted for in mainstream history, not accounted for in mainstream understanding. There is this thought process that Greece and the Aegean is the center of knowledge, and that the Fertile Crescent is where the first civilizations arise. There is this thought process that this is the only place of civilization, yet I would argue that what came out of the Fertile Crescent is not as civilized as other spaces in the world, because what came out of that space ended up being, depending on which region you go, because there are some regions from that space who still practice traditions that are absolutely indigenous and absolutely connected to the land in those spaces. When you take the Greco-Roman thought process and put it in the rest of the western part of Eurasia, there is this thought process that the first civilization is within their roots, which they take back to the Fertile Crescent, right? And a lot of that has to do with that whole Garden of Eve scenario as well, our Garden of Eden scenario as well. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're looking at justification for atrocity. You're looking at ego. And so with that, this is where civilization was. This is the first place that you're seeing these things. This is where we find it. This is where it's found. When in reality, it's seen earlier in spaces across the globe. The gardening systems that we see here in Abiyala and in the islands of the South Pacific are so advanced that we're just now rediscovering them, and we're calling it, like green and ecologically, we're putting all of these different Western labels on them instead of understanding that they've always been. We're just now appropriating them again, right? When we're looking at these understandings of us as a species, we again have this idea that we are the center, special, unique. We need that special and we need that unique. And there are things that define us from the vast majority of other species that we currently live alongside today. Neledi shows us that it goes deeper than that, and we are not the first to be where we're at. Now, I'm not saying Neledi had cell phone. I'm not saying that they had, the different things that we do today. I am saying that there is this understanding that just like there's this understanding that there aren't vast cities in Turtle Island and Abiyala predating the vast cities in the Middle East, I guess. I don't know what the correct terminology for the Fertile Crescent is other than Fertile Crescent. Predating those cities, predating those civilizations, even though there are vast cities and civilizations here predating those, we don't associate that in the same way that we don't associate that there are other species before us that could have had civilization, and that civilization could have blown to the wind and we wouldn't know, especially if we were looking at species that believe still in the returning of the cycle, believe that life is all about this cycle, this intermixing with the biome, this living and dying, this returning to the earth, this becoming one, this working together, this being involved, right? Neledi gives us a show of that, gives us this understanding that there is this possibility before us. This does not equate or cannot be equated to some form of ancient aliens theory, and this cannot be equated to some form of there was one group that knew everything and they were so technologically advanced that they were flying around in cars, and then their world sunk into the sea and they had to rush out and give everybody else knowledge. That's not how that works either. It does still equate to the idea that our species origin is in one space. It is in Africa. And that, we have admixture from several other species. Our species coalesced in Africa before it left Africa completely. We consider the Levant area and Saudi Arabia as part of Africa at this time, really because of the fact that many continents are bigger continents and the sea there is pretty much gone. So in that northern tip next to the Nile, where the Nile has always flown, and the Nile has been a home for Homo species, the entire existence of Homo, and was even a home to things like Paranthropus boisei prior to Homo. So almost all the hominin species after the last 7 million years, right? In fact, some of our earliest finds of us, the root mammal that creates us, even the last common ancestor or missing link that we think between us and chimpanzee, even all of those things come from that area just a couple of million years ago. So when we're seeing that space within there and we're seeing us starting to move out, we do absolutely all start there. That doesn't mean all of our traditions start there. That doesn't mean all of our thought processes start there. it means that we are one species. And as one species, it is our unification melting pot as a species that creates us as a whole. And therefore, we have to make sure that we understand ourselves as a species as something that is more of a convergent of many instead of a unique. If we come onto the scene at 300,000 years ago, and Neledi has already been on the scene doing these things for at least 35,000 years, if not more, when we're meeting Neledi, we're not doing these things. So, does it spark it in our brain and therefore we see it later on? Or is this an evolutionary process that we see in Neledi as well? Or is this something that you're seeing in lots of different groups, just in different ways at the time? When we're looking currently at our understanding of our convergence, we do believe that Neledi is not contributing genetically to that convergence as a species. Yet we do believe, it seems, that we came in contact with them. So, and we also believe that we so far do not see any evidence that we're doing anything along the same lines, or that Homo erectus is, or that antecessor, the subspecies of Homo erectus, antecessor, erectus, heidelbergensis, things like that, that we all seem to have come from the convergence of. When we're looking at that, we don't see us anymore as coming as a unique thing. It is a really kind of like, we didn't believe that that kind of convergence or that kind of speciation really existed until we saw this in us. And yet, we also have this understanding that it's not like new, because we also know that Erectus did this as well, that this seems to be the way that Erectus came about. Sorry, I'm trying to think through some of these things with it as I'm talking, and so I have different things popping in my head about it, and I'm like, wait a minute, no, I don't think that that's it, and I have to sit there and think through it. And that's because when we're looking at the stuff with Neledi, it is just so new to the scientific field. Some of the understandings that we see coming out about us are things that I believed the whole time, and I love seeing them prove true. I could have never imagined a Neledi. I would watch the documentary because you can see within the documentary things like the presence of fire. And so when you're looking at the documentary, or you're looking at things, if you see like soil that is extremely differently colored, like if you got light soil everywhere and all of a sudden you have a black patch, that's presence of fire. I was pointing that out to the grandchild while we were watching it. So you'll see that in this movie, or not this movie, in this documentary, but you'll also see, and this is the thing that I would really keep an eye out for, and the thing that I'm going to be watching for and trying to find more information on, is the carvings, because they're just fascinating. And the few glimpses that you get of them are just fascinating. I paused and looked at it and, kind of dug in a little bit. Yet I would love to see what's coming out of the project when it comes to those. When we are as a community, I think that this will give us a broader understanding that there is this humanity in earlier humans that we don't often think is. Some of the people within the community absolutely believe that, and some people within the community absolutely not only believe that there is a humanity within the prior humans, understand that that humanity could have washed away with the wind. Yet some still don't even ask local indigenous groups about the history of an area before they, are trying to decide what was done in this area, right? So when we're looking at that, that's important. And I hope that that fuels this understanding that we should be listening and interpreting in different ways and in different outlooks. Of course, I don't want to compare on any level the idea that current indigenous groups are in any way prior hominin species. So let me clarify with the last part of it that, like, I don't mean to intend that on any way. I totally believe that, no, I don't like that phrasing. My knowledge is that when I look at indigenous groups, they're definitely way more advanced. I think that it would be a comparison of understanding that ignoring what's in front of your face being screamed loudly has led us to a place where we don't understand ourselves, and now we're getting this new understanding because everything is screaming loudly about it, right? So I just find what we're seeing with Neledi to be brilliant. This skull here is, I believe, Lee Berger holding a child skull that they found. Absolutely. So when we're looking at Neledi, because I know that, so I'm trying to get people to understand a concept, right? And so I know that I'm taking it in a couple of different places. So when we're looking at Neledi, if you've watched the documentary, if you have looked at Neledi, what is fascinating you about this? What is really doubling down on your holy shit moments, right? And if you haven't been, what is something that what is something about us as a converging start that really fascinates you? I'm going to look through and see some comments and questions. I have been trying to ignore it as much as possible just because of the fact that otherwise I get distraction. Hey, Ami, it's good to see you. They did find one tool in the hand of a child, Patrick. That was something that fascinated me as well. So, one thing that we associate with ritualistic aspect of burial is finding tools and just objects, belongings in a grave. So, in this, they find a tool in the hand of a child. In this tool in the hand of the child, um, it's the only tool so far that they've talked about. They have found another tool like this in an early sapien burial. And the tool like this in the early sapien burial, oh, I can't remember a whole lot on that. I don't remember age or anything on that. So I'm not even going to state with that. But they have found a tool in an early sapien burial that is shaped similarly. When they're looking at this tool, they equate this tool to the carvings on the wall, which was fascinating. Oftentimes, when we're burying tools with somebody, it is because it is a skill that they're really good at or something they spend a lot of time doing, something that we know that they'll need in the afterlife, something that we know that they'll need when something new comes along or when the next step is coming along. When we see that, we're seeing this relationship to the life lived and what they somewhat kind of what their role is within community, we think on a lot of levels. And as burials become closer and closer to our timeline now, we definitely think that more and more that you're buried with the tools that you used in life. So does this mean that all of the carvings in the tunnels are from the child? Was there a child so creative, so sparked, right? Um, where does this fit into the scheme? The thought process that this tool is used specifically for carving these walls. The tool is worn. The tool is worn in the hand and in the usage. So it looks like it, might be a passed down tool, right? But it could be a tool that the child itself made, that the child themselves made and used to carve into the wall, right? So when we're looking at that, what does that mean? What does that spark? What does that give us? Oh, it's just a fascinating thought process. And really what it is there's so many different levels of what it means, right? Does it mean that the child used that tool themselves or was the tool itself passed down? Um, was this the idea of what they did within society, but they were a child, and how does that translate out? Um, does that translate out to family tradition? Um, this child, I believe they said, was in a little bit more of a unique space. And I know some of the carvings were over the grave themselves, but I believe that there was some carvings on the wall over a couple of other graves. And if there was carvings on the walls over a couple of other graves, do we then get to the point that the carvings on the walls over the other graves are made by that child, right? If we're associating that child with the carvings on the wall. So many different layers to just the idea that there is a tool in the hand of a child. So we've only found like 16 or 17 individuals currently, right? But they're still digging down. They believe that this is over 100,000 years currently, but we're still digging down. So where are we going to go from there? Is this a vast civilization that built up and one portion, one family, one line within that vast civilization that was built up buried their dead in this particular cave, and other lines buried their dead in other caves or in other spaces, or maybe they buried their dead exposed? There are so many different levels to this. How do I feel about the material culture of Neledi supporting language? I think it's writing, but I haven't looked close enough, so I don't want to say it because I don't know. Like, like I looked at that and I went, that looks like runes. That looks like runes. That looks like runes. That looks like runes. Oh my fucking god, that looks like runes. And I mean, literally sitting on the couch, like giggling. My grandchild sitting next to me, like she understood because she likes this kind of thing, so she was like, "Oh my gosh!" But I'm like, "Ooh, ooh, ooh," like I might as well have been at the best concert everywhere, anywhere. It was definitely me at New Kids on the Block when I was 13. I mean, it was, you know, um, if there's writing, that means there's language. He did state that there is no evidence of them having language. He did state that we don't believe that they had language so far. So how we tell whether or not a species before us had language or whether or not we had language early on is by the imprinting in the brain on the interior of the skull. And that imprinting of the brain on the interior of the skull, there's pathways that indicate language in our brain. We double that down with the chest cavity and the way that the lungs sit in the body. The way that our lungs sit in our body give us the ability to breathe and expel. Not breathe and expel. Breathe and speak at the same time. Like give us the ability to intake and exhale air at the same time that we are speaking, right? To some extent. So when we're looking at that, we have to look at these differing components. If we find a hyoid bone, this would indicate speech, but we didn't find a hyoid bone of a Neanderthal until about 5 years ago. And before that, maybe it's more like 10 years ago now. And before that, we thought that Neanderthal couldn't speak. And it wasn't until we found the hyoid bone that we started looking at things like the pathways of the brain and the skull that's imprint, or the chest cavity and the way that the ribs are set up, right? We started looking at that. The breathe in the lungs is also about like the muscle compressions. And that has to do with the way that our ribs stack, right? So because we're starting to look at that, we can understand more and understand deeper. So far, we don't think that Neledi spoke. Just because something doesn't speak does not mean that it doesn't have advanced language. Personally, for Witta, I believe that language that is less verbal can be way more advanced. Verbal language many times fails to communicate a broad spectrum of things, especially alone. If somebody waves their hands a lot or is expressive, it can communicate a little bit more. It still is not a very good communicative tool, especially when you can have things like twitching of your ears, or like, like scent, that will tell you so many more things, right? We know now that trees communicate. We know now that all the plants outside communicate. Plants can hear it when you eat them. So make sure your plants are dead before you eat them. Or what kind of ick are you? Just saying. But when we're looking at all of these different scales of languages across the world, language does not have to be vocal to be a complicated language, to my mind. There would be a lot of people that would disagree. That belief system means that when you're looking at advanced language and having writing or having different symbology that's associated with advanced language, it doesn't have to be somebody that is able to actually vocally speak to still have an advanced language. That symbology is a huge part of, right? Think of the fact that sign language alone is a lot of visual, right? So if you're not speaking and you're creating visuals already with your hands, like so say that you're a species that has expressive language, and so it's the different shapes with your hands and the different cock of your brows that indicates a thought process to somebody else, right? And this can be like whole word thought processes. When you're looking at that, you see that I can make shapes with my eyes or my hands towards you that can easily be drawn, that can way more easily be expressed in a visual on a wall or in the ground than a word. How would I visually draw word, right? How would I visually communicate word to you without writing it out as an alphabet? I could visually communicate fire to you, right? Uh, I could visually communicate a couple of ideas to you, writing it on the ground or writing it on a wall, drawing it, right? Through art, through expression of art. But how do I create an abstract, right? So I would state that if your language is about being emotive or expressive, or not as vocal as ours is, that your language might actually be more easily conveyed in symbolic art, right? So maybe this species is actually very advanced in their language, yet they don't visually or verbally communicate. And so they have the ability to communicate that advanced language in a symbolic manner that doesn't come around for hundreds of thousands of years again, right? So it's an amazing thought process. And holy crap, I mean, literally giggling, jumping up, it excited me so much. I'm so enthralled with the idea that they had symbolic expression. That to me is just like Mm, right. I'm going to go back and look through a little bit. I'm going to ask if you could like the video. I'm going to try and do some answer some questions. And Sleepy, please make sure, or anybody else who's modding, please make sure you absolutely do pin up questions so I can see them, because as I'm talking, um, it's really hard to see them sometimes. I'm trying to ignore them as much as possible as well, or I get distracted. I don't know. So we do absolutely need more evidence for verbal language. I do believe that the material culture, especially with that stick, if you could think that if, and I know that Lee is not at this point of time, and I know that there's not archaeologists out there that are at this point of time. That's why I want to get a closer look. Uh, if you look at that and can associate it with some form of verbal, or not verbal, communicative symbology. I think symbology is not a word, but I'm not sure if that's just Boondock Saints playing in my head. Um, if you can communicate it as communicative symbolism, you're absolutely, it's this material culture supportive language. I just don't know yet. I'm still looking. Well, and of course, when Lee went down there, not only did he see the writing on the wall, not only did he see the art on the wall, but he also saw the fire on the ceiling. There's a couple of other things I believe he probably saw that he's going to be telling us soon. One thing that I really liked was that he was like, once I got in there, I saw that how could you see this as anything else from but a grave? And he had given himself pause before that, other people had named it such, but he wasn't positive. And so he kind of went to the other people who had named it such, and he was like, it's a grave. How can you see it as anything else? I'm like, uh-huh. So it was good. The documentary was Cave of Bones on Netflix. I should put that in the website so that people can see it. And it is, I mean, the biocultural anthropology understanding, pretty much that's me converging several thought processes through my head. That is not something anybody else, and in fact, if you said that to any other archaeologist or anthropologist, they'd probably go, well, she's fucking crazy. uh, that is absolutely my head, and just where my head goes, holy shit. um, that does not mean that that's truth. I need to look and see, right? Yeah, and there are so many different things that have body language and sign language. Vegans will starve now. I've been telling vegans that for a while, and they still aren't starving. They're still eating plants because plant screaming doesn't seem to bother them as much as the thought that you can humanely kill an animal does. Um, The carvings are similar to Neanderthal carvings. Sarah says the carvings are similar to Neanderthal carvings as well. Can they have met? Um, there's a possibility, I'm sure. So Rising Star Cave is in South Africa. That doesn't mean, and we've only got 100,000 years for this species, and to our knowledge, they haven't. That does not mean that they cannot have. So it is possible that they did meet. We do see that the hash mark um, is actually seen in the earliest cave art of Sapien and Neanderthal. So the earliest carvings that Sapien and Neanderthal have done, and he goes over this in the documentary a little bit, the earliest carvings that Sapien and Neanderthal have done both have hash marks. And so he does go over the similarity. Uh, whether or not that means they met, I do not know. It could be that they never met, yet sapiens saw it on different stones. It could be that it's on caves all over down there, or like all around the rising star space in South Africa, and nobody's ever attributed it to that before. And Homo sapiens saw it when Homo sapien was down there and went, "That's really friggin' cool," and carried it out with them. Um, it could be that this is a very easy mark to make in just scratching a few straight lines, right? And in scratching a few straight lines, you get like that inner square, right? That's kind of like an X marks the spot in some ways, right? So it is very similar. That could come from a lot of different reasons, and I'm not exactly sure. It could be an independent thing created by all of them, or it could be something that is translated through. Ancient grains, perhaps modern grains aren't always the best. It's quite a nuanced subject. I agree with that comment. I would state that I think one of the problems that we have with modern grains is the processing of modern grains, as well as the way that they are grown, and the fact that they are in legitimately everything we eat. Um, Mono diet is really hazardous for anybody, unless you're a species intended for a mono diet. Knowledge and ancestry. Lori Ann asks, are there any grant fundings for further studies and evaluations, and where are the specimens kept? My understanding is that Lee Berger is still heading this, and that he is, I mean, as the archaeologist heading it, he'd probably have the specimens themselves kept in a space like the museum that's associated with the site. Like usually a lead archaeologist is working like for um, not necessarily for, but is granted or funded by a certain group. And so because they're funded by a certain group, the belongings and the humans involved might go to a museum. They might go to something else that's like state funded or government funded, just different spaces. They don't go to privately funded space, like artifacts don't go to privately funded space. They do go to either a publicly funded space or, like a state or government funded space. Yet the funding can be from somebody else. And so it's going to depend on where the funding is coming in from here and here. But he is still working on it. Any grants and anything on it currently are probably going through him. I mean, I'm sure that there's ways that people can get on the internet and find that information, but I'm not really good at ever finding information on people. I don't like go and research people very often, and so I really wouldn't know. I love the discussion on food in chat. That's amazing. Non-GMO corn is a huge specification. Huge specification, Giovanni. I agree. That's the Rising Star Cave. Is it in the southern part of South Africa? Yeah, I do believe so. I think it's outside of Johannesburg, to my understanding, but I am geographically challenged. Um, and it could also be the easiest way to carve a rock. To me, it would be okay. So straight lines that are crossing combines the easiest way to carve, which is the straight lines, with something that is a symbol itself. And that's why I think the hash mark is coming out. How legal? That's why I think that we see that hash mark is because when you, I personally think it could be cross correlated, because now that doesn't mean that it's the only way I think it could be cross correlated. It's just one of the main thoughts in my head is that um, drawing straight lines is easiest in any carving you're doing, whether it's wood, whether it's rock. In any carving, a straight line is going to be your easiest. And then just a couple of straight lines doesn't really look to our mind like a symbol. It doesn't really, straight lines aren't really seen in a lot of places, and yet still they're not so unique in our brain that we're like, oh, that's so unique. So I think taking the straight lines and hashing them becomes much more symbol in our brain, and that's why it correlates across as a couple of different species seeing this as the earliest way to my spot. This is mine, like mine, you know. Um, or I was here. Our earliest I was here. I think I like our earliest I was here better than our earliest mine, because I'm not sure if we had a concept of Earth being possessible at that point of time. So I would like, or I like the idea of our earliest I was here better than our earliest this is mine. I do think with the grave association that it might be a grave association of this is the person that is here, or there is somebody here. I've marked this spot so somebody knows that I know to come back here. When I'm coming back, I know to come back right here. And the next person knows that this is where grandma is. So we had quite a few people in last night. I think that it comes maybe maybe it's nighttime and more people. Um, I'm not sure. Uh, Remember to like and share, I guess. And that might boost it. Other than that, I don't really know. But sometimes there are a lot of people in here. Sometimes there are not. We started out with a few hundred a day. It just got down to 20, and it just got down to 20. So we're good. We're good. And I was not going to go live for too long today, anyways, because I've got some other stuff going on today. Um, I will, since I got the live access back, be going live again. Over the next couple of weeks. We tend to keep it a few times a week, and I'll try and make sure that I'm popping up the event. The problem I get with popping up the live events is that I might not feel like it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It might not be working for my brain. So if I promise I'm going to be here, it makes it harder. But I will be going live, and I do believe that it's going to be out a little bit more on the feed. And it looks like it was the last couple lives than it was before. So absolutely, Giovanni. Um, Hi, SoCal. It's good to see you. And hi, Lunar. Why is diabetes 1950s prevalent with some Native Americans if they eat well? GMOs popular in the 90s. I think that the reason that diabetes is so prevalent within some indigenous cultures is because of commodities, and because of the fact that they don't eat well. And I think that for some, it may have a genetic or epigenetic connection to the fact that their ancestors were used as test subjects for diets in indigenous schools, and not indigenous schools, but in Native American schools run by the Catholic Church, in residential schools. That's the in residential schools. I know that word. I don't know why it was popping different. In residential schools, and as well as studies done on Indigenous children who were not put in residential schools in their local schools. And so, with the nutrition programs and studies, that could be an epigenetic thing as well. Uh, Yet, I mean, I remember commodities from a child, or as a child, and the health is not really there. you know, it, it hi- you can only do so much to make something that's not healthy healthy too, right? And many people know how to uh, take something that is unhealthy and add a couple of different things to kind of make it a little bit more healthy. Yet it doesn't mean that it's going to get completely more healthy, right? So I think that that's why we see a high prevalence of diabetes still on many reservations. Um, So I think the most interesting things that I saw with Naledi were what I like I said, I don't want to say it's writing because it's, I haven't looked at it deep enough to be able to say. It looked like it to me, and it made me giddy, and it made me jump, and I'm going to be doing some further research in it. I also, it was really cool in the documentary where you could see the difference of fire in the ground, because I don't think a lot of people know that. And I also really just loved the confirmation of some of the things we talked about before, and the presence of a couple of new things. And we'll be talking about Naledi more, of course, over the next few weeks. Um, I want to make sure that we get back into doing a couple of other the things that we've been doing recently, and getting a couple of different Indigenous lives going, both for groups in Turtle Island and Abiyala, and for groups on other side of the world, that are Indigenous, that are, just as much of this part of reparation and recovery, um, and resilience as people in Turtle Island and Abiyala, so that we can make sure that we're getting that broader understanding and community as well. I think that it's the processed foods that have a lot to do with that. That's the problem with commodities, is that they're so heavily processed. The comment was there's diabetes in Mexico too, that we have a lot of fresh produce, but a lot of processed food. And I think that it's the processed food. I think it also has to do with being a mono diet, grain diet, like, and not like Mexico is a mono grain diet. I think at this point that the globe is pretty much mono diet, grain diet. Um, our monograin diet. You might see that there are two different grains. Like, if you go into your cupboard right now, most of us pulling out food are going to see that there's a lot of either wheat based product or a lot of corn based product, right? So you've got two different grains there that are used in so many different ways in pretty much anything that you have in your cupboard. It's really hard to find things without wheat gluten in them, and it's really hard to find things that don't have some form of corn within them, whether it's like corn syrup, like don't have some form of corn in them. So when we're looking at that, I think that combined with over process causes health problems, personally to me. Um, I think that we see that played out over and over again in the medical things that I have seen. Um, Yet I think that some people would not identify it like that. We have acknowledged that the food pyramid is really kind of jacked up, and that we really shouldn't be eating as many grains as we are. Uh, Yet I'm not sure that we've gotten to a point where we're like having a mono diet is so bad. Or even a point of understanding of how mono our diet really becomes, right? Um, I think that when we're looking at I think that we're looking at our evolution and our diet throughout history. It has never been just one or the other. It has always been, we've got evidence of Neanderthals making bread, flatbread. We've even got, with the lecture that Lee Berger did when he was talking about the fires, um, there was a look of what looked like a little mini oven, almost like a flat over, right? It was either in that or something I saw in Neanderthal. I'll have to go and look and double down. I do know I saw it in Neanderthal as well, where there is like I think that there was one that we saw in Neledi, or I saw in Neledi, and we had talked about in here. But I think that or I know that there's also one that we've seen in Neanderthal where it's like almost an oven, like fire underneath, lid on top. So you can both cook on the lid on top, and like you can have a space that the fire is cooking things in a more condensed way, right? Um, so you do see that there is a lot of different food culture within earlier species. I'm going to go ahead and go, because I was only going to do an hour this morning. Starting probably Monday, I will be back, and I'll try and do Monday morning. I may do Monday evening, just because I know that I want to get a couple of evenings in as well, just so that it goes across every space. I want to make sure that I touched on the vast majority of everything that I wanted to touch on. We will talk about Naledi again. especially as we see more coming out. I think I'm good. I'm going to end with what I want to try and end with as much as possible. And usually we see this when we're talking about our species development. We are a nurturing and communal species. We are creative. These are things that are innate to us. Toxicity is not innate to us. Toxicity is anything that counteracts our species' health. And when we're looking at the fact that we are innately nurturing and innately communal and innately creative, we can see that these things contribute to our species' health as well. We see these things because of biology. We see these things because of the structure of our body. When we look at all of these things and we understand all of these things, we see these things because of how many life stages we have from neonate, firstborn to adult. When we look at all of these things, we see that it takes an entire community to nurture and raise a child from infancy to adult, an entire community, everybody. So both male and female biologically, and there are biologically three genders or three sexes, not genders, biologically three sexes. When we see these things and we see the world today that is a lack of that community, a lack of that nurture, where both community and nurture have been demonized. If you are in this community and you feel this pain, this disconnect, this depression, this anxiety, this, oh my fucking God, why do I have to deal with this? Remember, please, that it is you who is most necessary. It is you who will affect the most change. It is you who are needed to get us out of a space. Because all the people up there who are like, fuck community, I hate community, you don't need to nurture nothing, are never going to find a need to nurture anything. It's not capable within their being. We need to switch back to a nurturing space. And the only way we can prevent our mass extinction, really, truly, at this point of time, is to switch back to nurturing and communal space. Please, please know that you are worthy and you are needed and you are valued and you are loved. And I thank you for being here. And I'm so glad that I'm not alone. And I want you to know neither are you. That pain and that depression is shared by many people. And we can make that change. Love you so much, everybody. I will see you tomorrow or Monday, my time, Pacific Standard. And I'll try and put out a when. Take care. And I'll be around. Bye. Maybe if I can figure out how to camera.